Today is March 30th. Our objectives today, we're going to talk about the Battle of Vicksburg, which comes right on the heels of Gettysburg, and something called the Gettysburg Address. And then if you tune in, when you tune in for one of my two Zooms today, I'm going to tell you a brief story about Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, something I'll leave out of today's lesson if you're curious. Excuse me, I'll try to keep it brief. There's no assignment today, but you will get a study guide maybe tomorrow or sometime this week. And our next test will be on Friday, Chapter 17 test. Just for your information for you to look at, here's just a copy of my lesson plans for this week. Tomorrow, Sherman's March to the Sea, one of my favorite stories. One of my favorite generals, Honey Badger of all the generals, tough guy, and you'll see why tomorrow. And I will try to drop the study guide in. Don't submit the study guide to me until I tell you to. Do not submit it until I tell you to, please, if I tell you to. Then we'll talk about the surrender of Lee to Grant and the situation and what is the reflex or the action that takes place as a result of that. And then another good story tomorrow, excuse me, for Wednesday, about a guy named Wilmer. Then on Thursday, we'll do a review during our Zoom. We'll try to do a Kahoot together as a large group. We'll see how that works, if it works. Your assignment then is to finish your study guide. Again, don't submit it unless I ask you to. And then on Friday, we'll take the test. So that'll be week 3 for us of our in-home learning. Okay, so back to where we left off last week. We just finished up the Battle of Gettysburg. And I'm going to try to keep today a little bit shortish, maybe. And we talked about the death and the casualties and how the Battle of Gettysburg is still, even today, one of the bloodiest battles of all time in American history because of the huge numbers of casualties. And we talked about the carnage and the destruction and the fact that this battle takes place in July in Pennsylvania, so it's hot and it's humid just like it would be here. And you see the uniforms these men are wearing are not necessarily made for summertime fighting. Well, that's in the East. So that's General George Meade in the East having some success, not a ton of success because he lost a lot of men at Gettysburg too, but at least defeating General Lee. And every time at this point in 1863, 1864, when the Union defeats the Confederate Army at any point, it's a huge victory because now we're starting to see the Confederacy beginning to have trouble replacing manpower when they lose men in battle. So even though the Confederates often lost fewer men in battle, the Union had better opportunities to replace them because their population was so much bigger. So at the exact same time as the Union was winning at Gettysburg, the very next day, General Grant captures a stronghold on the Mississippi River called Vicksburg. Remember, of the 3 parts of the strategy to defeat the Confederacy, one of them was to capture the Mississippi River or control the entire Mississippi River. Farragut already had control in New Orleans, and Grant is working his way south. Vicksburg is the last stronghold. It's it. With the capture of Vicksburg, now one of those 3 parts of the strategy by July 4th, 1863, is done. What Grant did is he held Vicksburg under siege for 47 days. We've talked about siege before. Maybe some of you feel a little bit like you're under siege because you're not allowed to leave the house or go very far. But 47 days with nothing in and nothing out. I'm going to guess that even you guys, at least for us, we make a trip to the store every now and then to get some goods. We need milk, every week and stuff like that for food. So the question now is, has Lincoln found his man to defeat Lee? Is he going to move Grant up to be his starting quarterback, using the sports analogy that we've used in the past or that I've used in the past? But Grant still has with him those 2 things that have dogged him throughout his military career. Does he drink too much? And does he sacrifice too many men? In Lincoln's mind, we're 2 years into this war, a little bit over 2 years into this war, 2.5. He wants it over with. Is Grant the man to get it done? So here's where these 2 battles are taking place. Here's Gettysburg, just across the border from Maryland and Pennsylvania, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And here's Vicksburg. there is no way, no possible way in 1863 that Grant knew anything big had just happened at Gettysburg. There's too great of a distance. It would have taken weeks for word to travel across this area. So, two huge Union victories right on the heels of each other, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of 1863. Though Vicksburg wasn't a one-day battle, it was more a capitulation, or the Confederates gave up because they were out of supplies. At some point, you got to run to the store. Here's what the siege might have looked like. These are some gigantic cannon. Just look at them in comparison with the size of the men, and look at the size of the cannonball those suckers could fire overlooking Vicksburg. Vicksburg also being shelled by ships, steamboats with cannon. Some of them may have been ironclad, some of them were still woodclad. So the city itself was really trapped. In fact, the people that lived in Vicksburg were so trapped, they had to move out of their homes because those artillery shells were so large that homes were being destroyed. So they literally burrowed into hillsides. These are houses. People were living in these dugouts. Life in Vicksburg for the residents who did not leave. The Union troops surrounded them for more than 5 weeks. People lived in these dugouts and ate animals or whatever they could find that they could get available to them. So imagine, if you would, we didn't have access to go to a store while we're on our lockdown. Eventually, we would run out of food, especially if we were forced to abandon our homes and our electricity and our freezers and all of the comforts that we're used to. It'd be pretty difficult. How about this guy? He's got even a nice little door to his hole in the hill. Welcome to my abode. Nice looking dude, got a nice looking suit on. But who knows what that looks like on the inside. I'd be curious to see. Site where the surrender takes place. Then by November, so that's in July, by November of 1863, President Lincoln was asked to, kind of a last second ask, and this is where the story from the Zoom will come in. So maybe by the time you actually watch this, you will have already seen my Zoom, or maybe not. But Lincoln was sort of a last-minute invitation to Gettysburg. So he scribbled together a note. You picture like on the back of an envelope on the train, part of it in the White House, but on a train on his way to Gettysburg, to give tribute or to dedicate a national cemetery. Lincoln wasn't even the headliner speaker there, and that's where our story is going to go today. But the famous part, the world will little nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here, paying tribute to those men that sacrificed their lives, which is kind of ironic also because the Gettysburg Address is one of the most famous speeches in world history. People around the world study the Gettysburg Address. It's very short and to the point, but the world will little note nor long remember. Well, of course, it's 2020 and we still remember. A video from Ken Burns, who does a lot of documentaries on the Civil War, about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. So let's watch this, please. Or not.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places. At Big Bend, Big Sandy, and the Big Sunflower River. From Bunker Hill, West Virginia, and Blue Springs, Tennessee, and Cairo, Illinois, to Golgotha Church, Georgia, and Christiansburg, Kentucky. At Citrus Point on the Cimarron River, and along Cowskin Bottom. At Pebbly Run and La Glorieta Pass, and Gettysburg.
I think if I had my choice of all the moments to be present at in that war period, it would be at Gettysburg during Lincoln's delivery of his speech. Maybe to have seen him craft those beautiful words, his marvelous healing words, and then deliver them. They were for everyone for all time. They subsumed the entire war and all in it. It showed his compassion for everyone. his love for his people. That's where I'd like to be.
On November 19th, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new Union Cemetery. The featured speaker was Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a diplomat, clergyman, and celebrated orator. The president had been invited almost as an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks. Everett spoke for not quite 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. A local photographer took his time focusing. Presumably, the president could be counted on to go on for a while. But he spoke just 269 words. He started off by reminding his audience that just 87 years had passed since the founding of the nation. And then he went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
He felt that he had failed, that it was a poor speech, that the people didn't like it. It was so brief, less than 2 minutes. He felt that he had failed. Layman, his friend Ward Layman, was sitting next to him on the stand. When he sat down, there was just a sprinkling of applause. And he said, "Layman, that speech won't scowl. That's what you say about a plow in the prairies when the mud doesn't come off it."
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. Chicago Times.
Dear Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Edward Everett.
"Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that their nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth."
Part of that story I'll elaborate on tomorrow in the Zoom, or excuse me, today in the Zoom. I'm actually doing this on Sunday night. So this is Gettysburg. If you ever visit there, I've never been, but 72nd Pennsylvania Infantry here. These markers are all sites of where things happened. So pretty big stuff. This should look familiar to a lot of you. Those of you that have seen the movie Remember the Titans. This is the cemetery, the cemetery at Gettysburg that Lincoln actually was paying tribute to in his Gettysburg Address, where they jogged through in Remember the Titans. If you haven't seen that movie, put that on your list of to-dos over your when you don't have much homework. And then we'll start up with William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in our next lesson for Tuesday. So Zoom today, Monday, either I think they're 10:30 or 12:30 are your social studies Zooms. I'll be there and hope to see all of your shining smiley faces. Don't forget, study guide later this week, test on Friday. Have a good day. Stay healthy.